Hello. I work for a company called SysAid, and they have allowed me to use their system that I'm putting together for them as a demonstration. So I thought I'd give them a little plug. So SysAid's basically just a help desk management, raise tickets, track tickets, that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, go take a look. So they're setting up a new environment in the cloud, and they asked me to set up some monitoring on that server, on that cluster. So I started looking into Nagios. I've dealt with Nagios before, but there's some caveats and some other tricks that I've picked up over the years. So first, the Nagios server is actually running on AWS, so an AWS is an AWS instance, so you have to enable access to it. It's just a AWS Elastic Cloud service. They're cheap. They do the job. And so first you have to go in and enable access from my current location, Google, which I just did, which is sort of like this sort of thing. So you basically got to allow the firewall in to let it access to your instance, which is my instance here. So now that I've got access, it will allow me to log into the website, which is, so for those of you who don't know, this is basically Nagios. So Nagios is basically the industry standard for monitoring in open source. You can group, you have all your hosts and what status they are, whether they're up, whether they're down, or what services are on them, and whether they're up or down. You can group your hosts together, so as you can have all your production 1 hosts in here, or your production 2 hosts in there, or your development hosts over there, and just group them like that. Likewise, you can also have virtual hosts, or not really, I don't think they call them virtual hosts, but you can group hosts and services into a group that you can treat as if it's another host. So if you could set, for example, have a host that has all the important services from all your real hosts, and treat it as being something that you're going to actively alert on or monitor up front. You can also, of course, with that, you can get notifications that the server's down, or this server is up or down, or whatever. And likewise, you also have plugins and additional features available. So the checks that it does is basically script-based. The scripts usually run locally on the Nagios server and go out to the server you're checking and check whatever status it happens to be that they're looking for. There are a lot of Nagios scripts and plugins available. One of the better ones is Nagios and P4P Nagios, PNP for Nagios, which is so Nagios is a tool that lets you graph those sorts of statuses that I was talking about onto a map, such as something like this. So you can have the results of all the servers in this location show up in this location as being green or red or whatever. Haven't done anything like that for this service, but it's certainly available. And I've seen someone else's project where they had their college and all the buildings in the college, and each building had a green tick or a red tick depending on whether the servers in that building were running or not. So it certainly can be very handy. I've also seen it done. I've also seen it done like this, where you can have an image of your actual rack and whether the server is up or down. So you can see on this one, they're showing that this particular physical piece of equipment has got a problem. One of the other tools that you have is PNP for Nagios, which does things such as, if I go into the services and say, for instance, I look at CPU load. So PNP for Nagios will do the graphing of what over time. So you can see, for instance, what your CPU load has been over time, over the last 4 hours, over the last 24 hours, and over the last week or month. It stores the data quite efficiently in that you can say for the last 24 hours I want to store a sample every minute. For the last week I only want to store a sample every 5 minutes or every half hour. So as you go further back in time, it probably becomes less relevant to you minute to minute what happened, and more relevant to you, and still relevant to you, what happened hour by hour. So you can tell the system to store the older data with less resolution and therefore not chew up so much hard disk space on your server. The cons of Nagios are quite a few things. Because the checks are usually individual checks, so say for instance you've got 20 servers and you have a script that checks, for example, a port or the status of the database or whatever, each one of those checks is going to be an individual connection to those servers. So it can get quite network intensive when you start to get a number of services up. There are other plugins for Nagios that work around this, and I'll get into that a little later. But the default Nagios has these network issues. They can be slow. Each check's a different connection, a check, a result. That takes time. And when you're doing lots of them, it can slow the whole system down. Likewise, setting Nagios up is quite difficult. There's a lot of config files, a lot of details. If you want to get into the details and set everything perfect the way you want, you've got to go through all the details and define all the details of the host and what services they're checking and what script that involves to run, etc. Likewise, the plugins. So the plugins are all made by different people. They install different ways. PNP for Nagios, for example, needed to be compiled on the server, and it didn't quite work for me when I tried it myself. So there are issues. A big part of the solution is CheckMK. So CheckMK is a Nagios plugin. One of the few Nagios plugins that I've come across that is actually very easy to install, and basically gives you a whole lot of features. So the first feature you'll see is that the interface is quite different. It's a little bit more pretty. You also have, I've got to scroll up. Let's see. You also have a service called Waito, which allows you to, remember how I was talking about grouping hosts and grouping services and setting people access and that sort of thing? So Waito allows you to do that sort of thing through the GUI, which is a little bit easier. But you don't really need to do it through the GUI, because one of the things the CheckMK plugin gives you is a lot easier config files. So CheckMK will have its own config files, and based on those config files, it will configure Nagios for you. So for example, so this is the CheckMK. So this is the CheckMK config file, and basically all it consists of is the host that I want to check, and some tags that I want to tag it with just for convenience and some later date. Now, that's all you have to do in Nagios. After that, in CheckMK. After that, when you do the command, re-inventory, CheckMK inventory, it'll contact each of these hosts. Based on what those hosts tell it, it'll configure Nagios with all the services that are on those hosts. The other thing that CheckMK does is that it's agent-based. So instead of having the script run on Nagios and go to the server for a particular check, and then another script go to the server for another check, CheckMK has an agent on the server. It does all the checks locally, and it gives one report back to Nagios. So you reduce your network load dramatically. So the default way that Nagios does this is with a simple port. So if I tell that to localhost, and I tell it port 6556, which is the CheckMK port, what it'll do is it'll connect to port 6556 on this server that's got checkmk agent on it, and it's got it configured such as you've got a service in most Unix systems called xinetd, which basically says when something connects to this port, run this program. Usually it's used for something like a web service or not so much a web service because that would be probably too much load, but if you've got some sort of network service and you're configuring an xinetd, when something connects to that network, xinetd will launch it and pass that port connection over to it. checkmk's agent uses it to basically do the report. So all it's done is that xinetd has been configured to run the checkmk report. So whenever something connects to this port, all it gets is a dump of the entire report. Very simple, but not very secure because it's obviously clear text, and obviously there's no authentication. So what I did is I went and configured it. Now you may have recalled back in this, if I scroll back up, you may have remember here, I've got this data source connected. So the default data source is basically to use the port. What I've told it here is that for any of these servers that have a tag SSH, I want to use this command to connect instead of the normal connect to the telnet port. And all this is doing is a SSH connection using this checkmk key, which I generated. And on the actual server, if I go into .ssh, so on the server, I've configured that key, this one down the bottom, which I'll highlight because it's all one big rotten mess. So all I've done is I've configured that SSH key. So as first of all, it'll only accept connections from the machine that I'm coming from, the Nagios server. It will only ever run this command. So because it's only ever running this command, it'll only ever run the checkmk report. You cannot use this key to connect to the server in any other way. As soon as you connect to the server with SSH with this key, it'll run the checkmk report and exit. That's it. So by doing that, I've not only secured it because it's now an SSH, I've also used an SSH key, which is more secure. And even if that SSH key gets away for some reason, still that SSH key is locked to only do the checkmk report. And it's also got things such as no port forwarding, no X11 forwarding, no agent forwarding, and no terminal. So you can't use this key for anything else other than that checkmk command. So that's the main things that checkmk does for you. The other thing that the checkmk agent does, which is also very neat, so the checkmk agent lives in here, and the checkmk agent comes into, by default, it gets you a whole bunch of things such as CPU, hard disk space, all that sort of thing. It gets that by default. Yep. So by default, it gets you a lot of things out of the box. But you can also add plugins by chucking the plugins in there. And you can also add your own local scripts by chucking your local scripts in there. And as long as they output to the correct format, checkmk will automatically take them in. Automatically, you do a checkmk inventory. It'll automatically add it to Nagios and configure it, and it'll automatically get graphed and all that sort of thing. You don't have to worry about the details of Nagios anymore. This is all well and good, except that you've still got a couple of problems. Your remaining problems are pretty much that you've still got to install the plugins, such as PNP for Nagios to do the nice pretty graphs, Nagios if you want that sort of features, and these can be troublesome because they're all installed differently. Some of them need compile and all that sort of thing. You also have the problem of updates. So, if you update your Nagios server, does that mean that you need to update your plugin? You update your plugin, does that mean you need to update the Nagios server? And of course, you've got to manage all that. Then I found something called OMD, which is Open Monitoring Distribution. So the guy who makes checkmk, he's gotten together with some other people and made this package. And what the package does is it bundles all this stuff in together. So instead of having to install the plugins separately and all that sort of thing, it's now all installed for you in a simple RPM. So all I had to do was add the RPM repository for it, do yum install OMD. That was it. It had the plugins, it had the PNP for Nagios plugin, it had the Nagios plugin, and the CheckMK plugin, all done for you. It also does it in different versions. So each version comes in and has its own directory here. As you can see here, I've only got one version. And what happens is, if I go, all you do then is do OMD create my site, and it'll create a site called my site. In my case, my site is actually called US_P1. And so it's created this site, USP1, and it straight away got your classic Nagios GUI, your CheckMK GUI, a number of other variations on CheckMK and all this other stuff. So it does all that for you, and all you have to do then is configure CheckMK, do a CheckMK inventory, and and you're done. So you get a lot out of that. Then when it comes time to upgrade, all you have to do is go into your sites, and you'll see that my site here, USP1, and all you have to do then is, if I go into USP1, you'll see that most of the important stuff, such as the software version and all that sort of thing, is all just symlinks to the version that I'm using. So the bin directory for what version I'm using is just going to version bin, and version bin is basically pointing to version 1. So then when it comes to time to upgrade, when version 1.2 is out, I can leave this site running on version 1. When it types, if I've got another site, I can create it with version 2. Or when I want to upgrade this, I just change this link. Done. Upgrade done. So that's about it. Any questions? Yep.
Can you figure out how long Nagios will be happy to accept stale data from the remote host?
So because the connection is from Nagios, there's two schools of thought about how to do monitoring. One, you have the server contact the machine you're wanting to check and monitor, and the other, you have an agent there that reports back. This is doing the first way. So Nagios is going out, asking the CheckMK plugin, what's the report, and it's giving the report. So it'll know straight away when the data's stale, because it won't be able to connect to CheckMK. It'll try to connect to CheckMK, and CheckMK won't respond, so I'll straight away flag it as an issue. It's not like it has to wait for so many minutes before the data's stale.
So it's not possible for that local daemon that's run from XINT.
Well, there is a measure for the better check and a better checks. And that way, if you can be another measure instance, it'll send those better checks. So maybe your agent will. So you can send the results to the measures. And the measures, for example, doesn't get those results for half an hour, then it can actually check the problem.
But this is going the other way. The CheckMK plugin is actually the one that's doing the connection. So if the CheckMK plugin does a test at a connection every minute, and if it goes to try to do that connection and it can't connect to the CheckMK agent on the machine, it'll straight away raise it as an alert. It's not like there's a timeout or anything.
You said before that there's a local app that's run by XINT.
That's one way of doing it. The default way of doing CheckMK is that it's that the CheckMK plugin in Nagios will make a connection to that port and get the report done. And we were doing it. This one's actually doing it by the SSH connection instead.
Yeah, so that then hits the local daemon that's actually doing the scraping in the first place.
At the time.
SSH and then talks to the local daemon directly rather than trying to pull recalculated data.
They're both doing pretty much the same thing. The only difference is the connection method. One's going telnet and one's going SSH. In either case, the CheckMK agent runs at the time the connection is connect to it, is triggered by the connection, and runs and connects the report at that time. All right, so it's not like it's the data is being collected locally and then you connect and get the result of the data. When you connect, the checks are done at that time. Yep.
All scales up increase the number of servers or when you increase the number of elements that are monitored and the frequency of monitoring. How it scales up, is it stable? We want to monitor like 100 servers.
I think it's highly dependent on how powerful your Nagios server is. But if you're using the CheckMK plugin, it'll scale a lot more than what the default Nagios will, because obviously you're getting the report all at once rather than having each test be in a separate connection. There was a test or a blog from the people who make CheckMK who said something about this, we've tested it to this many servers or this many monitoring, that sort of thing. It was some astronomical value that was well and truly outside my range. I can't remember what it was now.
500 servers for
A 2-second Google search found 35,000 devices, 1.4 million service checks.
There you go.
In a 2001 presentation, Daniel Wittenberg.
one Nagios instance.
The
One Nagios instance, so it's distributed setup.
Oh, yeah, it's quite a distributed setup, yeah. There's a presentation.
Is that with the CheckMK plugin, or is that with just default Nagios?
Whole bunch of stuff. Read the talk.
Yeah.
They've got NRP, NSTA.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think you can keep that Nagios service. Yeah, because what you can do is you have Nagios service more towards the edge, doing monitoring, per se.
You can cascade them, so you can have a master Nagios server and have a Nagios server for each of your sites, and then master Nagios server will combine the results of all the other ones, and then you can have a more distributed sort of thing that puts less load on your master Nagios server, and you distribute the load on all your Nagios server for each site.
So you use Zabbix, right?
Zabbix is the one that we were using, that the old monitoring was being used. This one's not going to use Zabbix.
Why are the CheckMK features not integrated in the main Nagios project? Like, is there a reason?
I think basically because Nagios isn't there to integrate everything, that the whole point of Nagios is that it's modular and plugin based. So there's lots of people who do different plugins for Nagios to do different things. And there have been certain features that, such as doing the remote connection and running multiple things, there are components in Nagios that will do that, or do similar sort of things. I found CheckMK to be the best one. It's much more user-friendly. You do a CheckMK inventory. So once I've defined what hosts there are, I do the CheckMK inventory. It goes and gets that report from the CheckMK agent on each of those, and based on the report, it'll actually configure Nagios with all those separate services. So you don't have to do any setup and that sort of thing. I'm sure you could pull it into Nagios, but then you'd have to do the Nagios config files, which is another feature that CheckMK does so well.
That leads to a lot of fragmentation if they want everything.
I don't think so. I think it reduces fragmentation because everybody uses Nagios. They just write a Nagios plugin to do what they want. And then someone else can just go and use that Nagios plugin, or that plugin might not be useful to them, so they use some other Nagios plugin. But the core Nagios is then still a single entity and not being fragmented. However, there are different versions of Nagios too. There's a Singa, which is a remake of Nagios, but it's also backwards compatible. As a matter of fact, this OMD distribution actually also includes Insinga and Shrekin or some other Nagios clone. It includes all three. So it's got Nagios, Isinga, and Shrekin, which is all Nagios clones, if you like, but it's all bundled together because there's enough, the core is common enough that they can just chuck them all in together. Anything else? Okay.
Just a basic question. If you have supposed to check this type of thing,
Yeah.
and you want a bunch of servers to run 1 part because you've got 200 terabytes, another set of servers to run 80.
Yep.
When you're actually pushing out the configuration of what part threshold
checkmk config file, you can define it. So the default is to warn at 80% and critical at 90, but you can change that to whatever you want.
My question is, you're pushing the configuration to the client. So effectively each client can have its own.
No, that's the agent will only report the disk space. The checkmk plugin on the Nagios side will read that information in, or it'll configure Nagios to read that information in, and it'll configure Nagios that this server is going to have a critical at 85%, whereas this server only has a critical at 90%. And you can do it based on the tags, right? How I showed the config file where you had a host and a couple of tags. You can have as many tags as you want. So you might have, host database, tag one host has been in the database server where you're more concerned about disk space, and further down you can say any host with this tag of database, I want you to alert at this level of hard disk space usage rather than at the default level of hard disk usage. And because you're doing it by tag, you only have to do it once. And if you have 10 database servers, you just tag each database server with the database tag, and that rule will apply to that database tag. Okay.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
You have a recommendation for an Android client, like this Android client?
I haven't really played around with the Android clients or that sort of thing. Nagios has the ability to alert by email, by all sorts of different things. You can configure operating times, alerting times, with different groups of people to be alerted to different servers. You can do all that sort of level of stuff. It's usually done by email or SMS. I haven't really come across Android apps for it, but I'm sure there would be. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.